Hi, everybody. I just wanted to hop on and talk about Virgo and Virgo season. And I really hope that Mercury, the ruler of Virgo, comes through and helps me out with my words because I've already restarted this like 5 or 6 times. Um, what I want to, as I do with most of the signs, we're going to go in the tarot today, right? So we're going to check out the Hermit, we're going to check out the Knight of Pentacles and the Queen of Swords as ways of exploring the Virgo energy. I'm also going to go um, a little bit in depth in a way that I feel like I don't do as often. I have a strong passion for combining the esoteric and the traditional esoteric with new self development tools and techniques. And I feel comfortable blending those things. But today I'm going to go a little bit sideways into some observations that I've made and what has been coming up for me in my own life and in some writings I have, and also in the lives of people I work with and in the lives of other people that I know and commune with. Um, and the reason why this seems a little bit weird to me, a little bit weird to share, is that it changes a bit of the traditional narrative. I love my traditions and I love being able to be like, this is the way this spiritual tradition taught this thing, right? And here are some new updates about the brain. But this is something a little bit different, looking into like kind of the psyche of the Western culture and the psyche of our culture this day, and some things that are transforming a little bit in relationship to some of these archetypes and in relations. And here today, especially in the relationship of moving through Leo into Virgo, I feel like there is a shift here that isn't necessarily the same as back in the day. And we'll take a look into that and a look into why that might be. So I'm going to present that. And hopefully I'm able to get through all this because it's also high holy days are coming up for the Jewish tradition. And it goes hand in hand with Virgo season, releasing a lot of things so that we can become the best people that we can be to serve and to serve the world. And with that comes a lot of emotional work. So I am exhausted from doing this and hoping that I'm able to carry it through. So let's take a look real quick at Virgo, and where she comes in the seasons. Okay, a bit of a technical glitch there. So we're looking at the cycle, and we have Virgo here in the sixth house. The zodiac cycle starts with Aries, right? Aries, the spring, you've got this new growth after winter. The shoots are rising up from the ground and things are starting to come to life. And you have that fire, that first cycle of the fire energy, right? This kind of like divine spark of life calling us to action, to movement. In Taurus, you see the plant life starts to create blooms, right? And in the elemental composition, we have fixed earth here. You have the physical world, right? You have the spark of the fiery spiritual world and the life drive. And now you have this physical world that is able to contain it into vessels, right? Just like the blooms are able to eventually receive the pollen in order to create new life. In Gemini, you have the mutable air sign, and there's now this pollination, right? There's this cross exchange of ideas. People are telling different stories, people are gathering information, people are sharing that information, and they're pollinating and germinating. And that process then creates the germination process of the fruit, right? So they're pollinating in Gemini, and they're fertilizing in Gemini, and in Cancer, we're now actually germinating. We're now actually gestating, and that then births the new experience, right? It births the new cycle of fire. And it births that new cycle of fire in the fixed sign of Leo, which eventually leads to Virgo. Now, this is where that like weird side stuff is going to happen, right? Because Leo has traditionally been assigned both sort of the rulership over our personality and more modern astrology, and our life path throughout the time of astrology, right? Going back at least to when they started caring about personal astrology. Original astrology, only really cared about the king, which is Leo, is typically associated with the king, and then what is going to happen to the kingdom. And then in Greece, they started being like, hey, well, we can use this for all sorts of people, right? It doesn't just have to be the king of Babylon or the empire itself. And so you have that switch, right? And everyone starts becoming their own son. Everybody starts becoming the king in their own life, the central figure of their own life. And that moves through slowly through development, through the millennia into the modern day where it's all about the individual, right? Like that is the collective culture, is that we're very concerned with our own personal story, and the ways that we interact with life and the ways that we traverse life. And so Leo becomes this energy of finding your authentic self, right? Finding your authentic self, that divine spark, and letting it shine. Um, and that's great. But people's experience of Leo season doesn't always seem to match up to that. And I'm a Leo, right? So it's my birthday season. And I know that for people going through your birthday season, there can be some difficulties, right? Wherever you're born in the chart, mainly because Venus and Mercury always follow the sun within a range of 2 signs, right? So anytime you're entering into like kind of your birthday season, there's a chance that a little bit before or a little bit afterwards, like the sun and Venus and Mercury are going to be rolling over some of your natal planets. And there's going to be a lot more transits during that time of the year, typically, unless you have like a cluster of planets somewhere. So there's more room for weird things to happen, more room for the world to kind of get a little bit murky or mucky or shine and great and be awesome, depending on how all the aspects work together. So I know that part of that is that experience. But I also see in other people and in their stories that the peak of summer, in particularly in Leo, can be very difficult for a lot of people. Um, and part of that, like we talk about Taoist elements and the way that they work with the energy and the seasons. Part of this is the fact that like there's a lot more energy in the summer, right? There's a lot more light in the summer. Taoism says there's a lot more fire energy during the summer. And so people who can have those higher extremes of mania, oftentimes that gets supercharged and there's more kind of mental excitement, right? And there's more action and thus there's more drama, right? People are socializing more, they're getting out more, and different personalities are connecting or conflicting or creating different chemistry. So all this kind of mixes together to create this a little bit more chaos than in other parts of the year sometimes, right? In winter, we have the reverse. There's less energy, right? So people will tend to feel a little bit more down, maybe a little bit more depressed. Whereas in summer, they feel a little bit more up, but sometimes that's uncomfortable, that's too far up, right? Or it feels draining to people because there's not enough yin energy to sort of support the process. But there also seems to be this shift in zeitgeists, right? Or this shift in the underlying archetypes. I know that for me, as much as I try to get into millennia, there's a poet, a Roman poet, a Manilius, who writes the Astronomica, and pairs patrons with each sign. And so for Leo, he actually has 2 patrons. Leo has 2 patrons, Jupiter and also the mother of the gods. Every other sign has 1 patron. And as much as I try to get into that, and I've been able to sort of start to touch that archetype, what comes up for me the most ends up being more of a Bacchian or Dionysian archetype. And that's what I see in more lives. And I feel like part of this is the conflict that occurs when we're actually called to shine with our own divine spark, to be that unique, authentic self. But we are in a culture that doesn't make space and room for that. It ends up being more chaotic. And I know, as someone with my own mental health experiences, and who works with a lot of people with mental health experiences, and I believe that this is universal, whether we're classified as having a mental health challenge, and thus we experience this maybe a little bit more drastically, or if it's a like, or if you're whatever normal is, and you're still going to experience this at some level. When there's a soul calling, when you have a calling, when there's something that you're meant to do, and you're not able to do that thing, like really on a soul fire energy level in astrology, meant to do this thing. So, like that Aries, Leo, Sagittarius energy, and we're not able to do it, or we're too afraid to do it because of the way that the rest of society is going to respond to us, the mind and body rebel, right? For me, it's blatant. I can't get away with it, right? I might be able to get away with it for a couple days. Eventually, I'm going to enter into a manic state, and my mind and body will go crazy until I do what it is I need to do, right? I know people who will, like, their body will just start convulsing, right? Their body will tighten up, like the muscles will just start convulsing, and they just don't have an option. Like they veered a little bit off the path that they're called to take, and it just goes sideways fast. And I've seen this happen in so many different ways, right? And Jung writes about this and writes about how so many of the difficulties that come up in our lives come up because we're not taking the path that we're meant to take, right? And different spiritual writers have written about this, different spiritual teachers have written about this. It's not a new concept that the universe slaps you into shape sometimes if you're going the wrong direction. Some of us, that's very immediate. Some of us, it takes a while, right? And that seems to be different for each person. But we're living in a culture that doesn't really make space and room for people to have these very powerful callings and to do it, right? I mean, of course, there's always been different traditions that, like, you might get stoned if you have the wrong calling, right? They're not the wrong calling, not saying that it's wrong, but like, if it doesn't meet with the tradition, like, you might end up on the outside of that tradition, and there will be some ramifications for that. And that is why there's been this push to leave behind a lot of these traditions. But at the same time, a lot of traditions, if it's within the context of that tradition, have made room to do what you need to do. If you had like, if you had experiences in some of the older traditions, and you were like, this God called me, I need to go to this other foreign land, or I need to go over there across the river, and I need to build an altar, and I need to fast there or feast there or do whatever it is that I got called to do, I have to go do that. Then in many of these traditions, you are supported in being able to do that, right? If like a plague is happening and you're like, okay, I got a vision from the spirits, and this new thing that they're teaching me is going to help like heal us, like there would oftentimes be support. Now that changed a lot under the monotheistic traditions, right? Because then it's like, well, that's heresy, and it gets persecuted. And there, of course, was persecution even in like the pagan traditions, right? There's no idyllic, perfect golden age. And in some shamanic traditions, there can still be some persecution, but there tends to be a lot more room, right? And you see this especially in shamanic type cultures. I know that when I was going through my dark night of the soul slash mental breakdown, one of the things that really spoke to me was going through anthropological accounts of shamanic cultures and societies, and looking at interviews of shaman where they like the anthropologists were like, well, how did you know you were supposed to be a shaman? And the shaman's like, well, I almost like died, or like I started just randomly talking in weird languages. And then like on one account, I remember the guy was like, I started hopping around like a frog. And I was like, okay, people would be locked up for that here. And then I went into my hut. I didn't start a fire. I made sure it was always dark, and I stayed in there for months, and I didn't move. And I was like, that's why I'm being medicated for depression, right? Like that's what I want to do. Maybe not the frog hopping, but like just not move and be in this dark state and just like incubate for a while. And for them, it was just like someone saw that, I was like, they're a little bit weird. they're probably talking to the spirits and we need to listen and like let's train them, right? And so now you see all these emergence, spiritual emergence communities and people talking about this and how their experiences have been coordinated or seem to be parallel to these other spiritual callings and experiences. And at the time, I wasn't connected to any of these like any of these communities. I didn't know this was happening. Like I was just getting a diagnosis, like you're insane. And I'm like, there seems to be some like the world seems to be insane. And look at these other cultures; they had different ways of handling these things. And you had a little bit more room and space, and you could be a little bit more crazy. And society wasn't as complex, right? So you had these smaller tribal village areas and arenas where, and like, if you did do these weird things and people were like, "Ah, I don't know what they're up to, but it kind of seems like they're working with the spirits or they're working with the gods or they're doing this thing or that thing. Like, the community can come together and most of the time you're not going to starve, you're not going to be homeless, right? Here, like you get the calling like, oh, I'm going to do energy work for people, or I'm going to do this for people, or I feel like I need to do this ritual for people. And if we don't find a way to gather support for that, or if we don't find a way to monetize that in some way in this capitalist society, then you're homeless and you don't have food, right? Like the levels of complexity. So there's multiple areas to this, right? First off, you do something weird in today's society, people look at you weird. Secondly, the levels of complexity of being able to just maintain a basic state of necessities, a basic like meeting of your necessities in the society is so much more complicated that unless you can find a way to take this vision, which is oftentimes very um I don't want to say crude, but very like it's like I need to do this healing modality, or I need to write this story, or I need to do this thing, and it's not like it doesn't come with a business download, right? Like it doesn't always come with a business download. Like for me, I know it's like okay, I need to work with people on suffering. Like trauma is a huge part of that, and on working mind, body, and spirit to heal and to grow. Like there wasn't a business strategy that came with that, right? It's like kind of like figure it out. How are you going to eat? How are you going to live while you're doing these things? And a lot of these things take up a lot of energy. They take up a lot of time. They take up a lot of concentrated meditation, a lot of emotional energy, a lot of things that like make it very difficult to be like, God, I'm going to work a 9 to 5, right? And I'm like, I don't have the mental and emotional and energetic capacity to do all of that, right? Um, and so when we're getting these calls in Leo season, and there's this divine spark, and it's like, let's shine in these ways, I think that leads to part of the madness that people experience during Leo season and part of the excess that people experience in Leo season. Because there is some aspect of now, like, this cauldron bubbling over, right? Or this pressure where it's like you need to fulfill this divine calling. You need to fulfill the spiritual calling of who you are. But then there are all these extra pressures from society to be like, you need to fit this mold. And there's the internal fire pressure kind of pushing out, and there's that external pressure kind of pushing in. And I think this is part of the human condition. This has been around since forever, but it's got different elements to it these days. And one of the ways that people tend to deal with pressure is through some levels of escapism. So I know that my escapism really kind of like takes off a little bit in the summer. And I've seen that in a lot of other people. Um, and I'm seeing this in different narratives and myths. Like, if you want to look at like the zeitgeist behind cultures, look at its artists, look at its authors, look at its painters, and you see this. Like, I'm gonna laugh at myself here a little bit, but you see this in comic books, right? Like Neil Gaiman has his Sandman. And at one point of time, and it's not explained why, but this sort of archetype of delight, right? There's the archetype of dream, the archetype of destiny, the archetype of dream and destiny. I don't remember, but death. And there's a few other ones. the archetype of delight transforms into the archetype of delusion, or delirium, not delusion. And you see this all throughout culture, right? There is a delight that comes from when you are able to truly shine, when you're fulfilling your divine role, right? When you're fulfilling what you're called to in this life, you delight in life. Delirium comes when we now have this vision of the world that can't quite fit, right? Because we don't have the resources to make it happen. Um, or we don't, it's just not merging in the right way with the physical world, but we're in this other world, whether it's the world that we're escaping into, or it's the dreams of the world we wish we had, but we're kind of interacting like we're acting as if we're in that world, but then there's the reality of the world that we're in here. And this arena of delirium happens, and you see this in the obsession people have now with mental health, right? You see this in the obsession people have with mad artists or insane artists and lunacy. You see this in this whole fixation now on altered states of consciousness, on um, the delirious and the dream world. And there's a lot of magic to that, right? Like there's a lot of power behind that. And so there's, I believe, a very key reason for why we're looking into these realms and looking into these states. But I also see some of the cultural fixation on it and cultural romanticism of these delirious states. And I think it's because we're finding ourselves more and more in them, as our as spiritual callings and kind of life callings are so distant now from the oddities of society that we have created, which are themselves so distant from the natural rhythm of things and the natural cycle of things. It's creating more and more and more this disconnect. And so you see that in these different archetypes that are popping up. You see that in Crowley's transformation of the tarot, right? You used to have the card of strength that represented Leo. It was a like kind of angelic figure, opening the mouth of a lion. It was very strong. It was very, very self-possessed. Crowley, and I think this is because he was tapping into the archetype somewhat, and I think it was because he was possessed by this changing archetype a little bit. Crowley changes that archetype of strength into the archetype of lust, which is supposed to be, in his writing of it, a lust for life, a lust for the experience. But it also is now bringing in this aspect of the delirium and that deliriousness and the drunkenness of that lust. And that image turns into this multi-headed lion, and essentially the horror of Babylon riding the lion, right? And it's a loss to it's a rendering process, which I do believe can in its own right become sacred. But in a lot of the experience, do believe that people are experiencing more of a distancing and more of not necessarily surrender, but a loss of that flame, of that divine spark. And then it kind of just like life happens and it takes over, and we enter into whatever excesses that we have, or whatever coping mechanisms that we have to deal with this vast divide between the natural order of things and the way that the world is and the spiritual calling that we have. And we try to just fill the gaps and fill the spaces. And in a consumerist society, many people try to fill that space with consumables, and especially things that alter states of mind. And so I know that in my work, when I'm doing the depth archetypal work that I do, I'm seeing a lot more of that, like, and it drives me crazy because I'm like, it's Leo, like this is my sign. I want to like get up there and be like, hey Jupiter, like what's going on? Like, hey Apollo, like what is the answer to everything? This is the peak of the solar year. Like this is the peak of the energy here. Like let's make something great. And instead, I'm like coming up with like Bacchus and Dionysius are showing up, and the gods are just like drunk and kind of sick on what's going on in life, right? And the how disconnected everything is, and dealing with their own sort of like those archetypes, dealing with their own sort of delirium in the experience. Um, and so that this was something I felt called to share because I feel like Virgo is the answer to this, right? There is a transformation occurring. We are recognizing that the ways that we are living do not match, like the ways that the society itself isn't living, does not hold enough space for our own divine calling and for the natural rhythm of things. And so you have more and more people waking up to that fact. And you have more and more people being like, no, we need to go a new way. And we're re-evaluating the way that we classify mental health. And we are re-evaluating and we're seeing like, hey, this isn't necessarily a thing of like your brain is broken. Like this system is broken. Like this world right now is massively broken. Like this is where the sickness is coming from, right? It's not coming from like it's not coming from people with the wrong genetics or the wrong, like just your brain just didn't end up right. Like there are so many other factors to this, and part of the factor is that spiritual fire and that spiritual flame, and that spiritual calling, and also the natural rhythms that we're no longer paying that most of society is not paying attention to. So there is a movement, there is a change, there is an awakening to all of this, and it calls for work. It calls for work, and it calls for that Virgo energy, right? Leo, all throughout time, has had a bit of excess, right? Like whether it's the drunken delirium or it is like, I'm strong, I'm going to go forth and conquer, I am the king. Like there's some sort of excess in Leo. Like that has been with the archetype forever. But that excess is a little bit more sick than it used to be, right? It's a little bit more delirious than it used to be. Maybe a lot more delirious than what it used to be. Virgo is the priestess. She's the healer. Like she is the mutable earth sign that looks at the practical issues of life, is like, this shit doesn't work, right? Let's make a new way of doing this thing. Let's plan something different. Like let's respond. Like that's what mutability is. It's an adaptation. And she is in the physical realm. She is the earth sign of adaptation. She comes through and she's like, this stuff isn't working. So she can list all the things that Leo has now experienced. And Leo's like, okay, I got this divine calling. I'm supposed to go that direction. But my job and my family and society and all this stuff, they're like, no, you need to go that direction. And I know that there's this natural thing happening around me, and I need to have this flow and this ebb and the highs and the lows and all this other stuff that I need to pay attention to, but it's overwhelming. And I got really drunk last night because it's just so overwhelming. And I kind of don't even know what to do anymore. Like I'm just here and I might just go drink again. That was me back in college, like this straight more. And Virgo could be like, okay, so we have the goal, we're heading that way. We have the constraints from back here. How do we readjust to those constraints, right? How do we reassess those? How do we cut those cords? How do we move forward? How do we get to where we're going? How do we take into account those ups and downs? All those things that you just experienced as a new baby Leo, like we're going to put in, we're going to figure it out, and we're going to create a life path, and we're going to go on that, right? And that is where Virgo can take those excesses and really start to process it. And I do believe like there are certain signs right now that are under different unique pressures because of where we are as a society. And I think it's difficult for all the signs, but I think there are certain, and I don't mean this like, oh, it's more difficult for Leo people born in the time of Leo. I don't mean that. Like we all have Leo energy. We all have Aries energy. We all have Pisces energy. What I'm saying is that Leo energy itself, I think, has a lot of difficulties behind it. Also think another one would be like Taurus, which is typically a great energy for connecting with your body, but a lot of people disassociate it now from their bodies. And so they become overly indulgent or overly neglectful in their relationship to their bodies and to the physical world. I think Scorpio can also be another one. That's Scorpio energy, which deals a lot with transformation and trauma. There's a lot of trauma happening. Um, and there is a huge call for transformation. So I think different energies are in different states of flux. And this is one of the relationships that I see in particular right now, is that Leo is going through a change. It does, like it, I don't think it will really be able to fully metamorphosize until it has kind of the opposite side, right? It has that Aquarian vision of like a new society that allows us to align our divine calling with the resources of society and the support of society and the natural cycle. Like those things have to come together in order to start to heal some of that delirium that is building up in that archetypal energy um, zeitgeist. In Virgo, I think is the first step to do that, right? Just go through, assess the situation, figure out what are the next steps, and do those next steps. And so that was a long rant. But when we're looking at her, essentially, we have Leo fifth house with the sun, sign of expression, Virgo ruled by Mercury, thinking it all through. What is the next step? And doing the labor that we're here to do, right? Like actually hearing the calling, stepping forward, and doing it. And that way, she's universal throughout time, right? It's always been. Some things seem maybe a little bit out of line, and now I hear this calling. I have a general idea for a direction. Virgo, let's go and let's get this done. And then along the way of getting it done, we enter into Libra and we find other people to help us get it done. And so that is part of that story. As far as how this relates to the tarot and how this relates to Virgo herself, let's talk about some of the features of Virgo. And let's start that talk with the Hermit. In tarot, the Hermit is the card that is most related to Virgo. It's the ninth card, which in numerology is the number of mastery. So it has come to the pinnacle of its own self mastery. The Hermit is looking within, right? I tried to find a female Hermit card, and there were some, but they were really like the art was weird, and I kind of felt like maybe I was stealing somebody's art to put it on here. But I was like, it kind of annoyed me that Virgo is this feminine archetype, and then we're going to this old man and this hermit archetype. But here we are. Random thoughts aside, the hermit is looking within, right? And Leo is all about shining. It's all about that extroversion. It's all about being out there. And in Virgo, she is an earth sign. She is active in the physical world, right? She isn't disappearing from the physical world, but she knows that the answers have to be a little bit more internal, right? The answers to the physical world aren't necessarily always going to come from that physical world. They have to be internalized. And that's a difference between Virgo and Gemini, the other sign ruled by Mercury. Gemini is like, let's exchange ideas. Let's gather information. Like, eat it all up. This is great. And then that starts to get gestated in Cancer. It starts to come into some form of fruition and ripening process in Leo. And then it starts to get edited down in Virgo, right? And she applies some of her own wisdom to it, and she mixes it around, and she kind of like cuts she's also the beginning of the harvest season. So she gets rid of the grains that don't really work anymore, right? Like the rotten fruit. And she gathers the stuff that is good, and she stores that away for the next year, right? The hermit is shining the light of that realization. Even as he's looking down, he's kind of looking more internal. He has the staff of mastery in his left hand, which once again speaks to the internalization of the fact it's the left hand. So it is related more so to the unconscious and to the inner world. and he has this mastery there, right? And he's on the top of a mountain or the top of a peak, right? He's come up to that level of mastery, looking down on the world and recognizing, like, okay, this is how it comes together. This is how it works. It's not the most active card, right? This isn't the active part of Virgo. This is the self-reflective part of Virgo. This is the wisdom of Virgo. That can be like, okay, you had your fun, Leo. Let's get shit done. And let's do that by taking the lessons that we've learned. He's the old he's the old dude, right? He's lived his life, he's had his experiences. Let's take those lessons, let's cultivate them into something, and let's cultivate them into a deeper understanding that we can then move forward with. And that is where you then see the other cards associated with Virgo. The first card associated with Virgo here is the Knight of Pentacles, which rules the transition between Leo into Virgo. So Leo starts off with the King of Wands, right? This fiery, charismatic king. It's totally Leo. It's just like, I have this vision of the way the world will be, and we will go out and we will make it happen, whether by conquering the world or just causing everyone to fall in love with me. I will make this thing happen because I am the Fire King. And then you have the Knight of Pentacles, who isn't as charismatic, isn't like, yeah, we're gonna like do it all just by the glory of who we are, but it's rather like, we're gonna do this one step at a time. It's sad that he's riding a plow horse, right? Like, plow horses aren't fancy, they're not fair horses, they're not what you ride in like to show off. They get stuff done, right? In the back are fields that are tilled. Like, you plant your crops, you reap what you sow, you plant again the next year, right? It's solid work, step by step. And that's Virgo, right? It is an active force. All the knights are active forces, but this is a slow and persistent knight, right? And it gets stuff done. The Knight of Pentacle, like the Knight of Flames, like, will rush in and be like, where's the damsel? Let's save the day, right? And it might get it done just by force of like will and charisma. The Knight of Waters or Knight of Cups might come in and charm everybody and tell us some poetry, and then maybe kind of daydream until they don't even remember what it was they were supposed to be doing, but they're having this experience and it's nice and it's dreamy. The Knight of like Swords will come in with an action plan and be like, okay, we're going to do these things. In typically it will get done unless it takes too long, and then the Knight of Swords will make a new action plan to go somewhere else. Knight of Pentacles, though, comes in step by step, and it will accomplish what it's seeking to accomplish because it is in the realm of earth. It will make physical changes. And then this goes hand in hand then with the Queen of Swords, who is also very empowered to get things done, right? So swords rule air energy. Pentacles rules earth energy in tarot. And you see these in the transitions, right? So between Leo and Virgo, you have that fire energy of the King of Wands turning into that earth energy, which is related to Virgo. And then, so there's that transition between the fire energy of Leo into the earth energy of Virgo via the Knight, which is the most active of the cards, and thus the most like kind of fiery energy of the court cards. But it's the earthy, fiery energy of the court cards. And then that goes into the Queen of Swords, which is the most typically seen as the more like feminine energy, because she's the queen. And it's the feminine air energy, sword energy, air energy. So it's cerebral, it's intellectual, it's also very practical, right? In this way, right? And other air energies, it can be a little bit more like, well, let's invent this really cool thing, right? And let's just focus on that. But here, she's the Queen of Swords. Like, she rules her kingdom. She has her action plan. She will ensure that it happens. And this is what guides the transition between Virgo into Libra, where you start bringing in other allies, right? And so you have this queen who's able to bring in other allies, right? You have this queen who's able to have some diplomacy to make sure that her vision happens, right? She knows that she has to be able to play the different courts, like she has to be able to bring people together in order to move forward. And so you have that Virgo energy transitioning into that Libra energy and finding allies to carry forth the mission that Virgo has. And that is very much the Virgo energy, right? Is taking that inspiration, that fiery spark from Leo, turning it into something that's like actually doable in the world. And then as you transition into Libra, finding other people to help with that. And one of the better examples of this is the Vestal Virgins, which are very linked to the Virgo energy, into the sign of Virgo. The Vestal Virgins, they were priestesses. They were responsible for essentially keeping Rome alive, right? There was Vestus fire, and in the city of Rome, and it was believed that if the fire went out, then Rome itself would be extinguished, essentially, right? So it was cared and tended for by these priestesses, and there were multiple priestesses. I think I don't want to mess it up. It might have been 9. I think the numbers shifted at some points. I'm not going to make up a number because I don't remember it right now, but there were multiple priestesses who were supported and sustained by the society, and empowered in their role to do it. They're not empowered enough because Rome was misogynistic. But these particular priestesses did have a considerable amount of social power compared to a lot of other women at the time. And so they take that fire, right, that Leo energy, divine spark, and they nurture it and they nourish it and they give meaning to this mundane act of like, okay, keep this fire going, right? But really, it's that spiritual heartbeat of the city and of the Roman Empire that they maintain. And they do it together, which is where the Libra part comes into play, and all the other associations that Rome had to bring in together and people bring in together to make it work. And so that really is at the heart of Virgo energy, right? Is that we are taking that calling, we're taking that relationship to the divine, and through practical methods and ritual and having this priestly relationship of care tending really the divine, and imbuing the mundane world with the divine, we merge the worlds of the mundane and the divine, and we bring those scattered pieces, the world as it is now, and the divine calling that we have, and the rhythms of nature, we bring them together, right? The flames and the different rituals that the Vestal priestesses, Vestal, I think I messed up there. Consciousness is starting to shift here. Hello, Pisces, full moon coming up here. The roles that these priestesses play were oftentimes tied to the seasons, to the harvest. Vesta was super tied to the harvest, and thus to the rhythms of time. And so this Virgo role really is about bringing all these things together into a functional life, filled with the rituals that keep the two worlds merged, that keep the two worlds as one, the world of the divine, the world of human society, and also that natural realm, which I believe is part of that divine realm. But we have our own experience of the divine realm, right? So we have our own divine calling, and then we have the natural world, and its cycles and rhythms. And then we have the world that we're in. And in that world, we have our Virgo energy calling us to bring it together, to figure out what works, and to move forward with that. Thank you. Thank you for sticking with me through all that. And yeah, and blessings on the work you do and on figuring out what it is that you need to do this work. I know for me, um, part of what I am figuring out is like, okay, I have my calling. I know that I have my calling. I've had to step past some of the pains of my family disagreeing with that calling, and go through the like psychological delirium that comes from when they are like, well, that's evil. And I'm like, no, it's the way I'm supposed to go. And then my mind and body rebel for a couple weeks, with lots of anxiety and all sorts of other mental health flare-ups, and I have to like be like, nope, this really is the way that I'm supposed to go, and get everything on board and aligned again and move forward. So that's one way that I've had to deal with this. Um, in the Leo season, and now in the Virgo season, I have to look at like, what are the practicalities, right? Like, I know that I'm here to work with people. I know that I'm here to work with people on their growth and healing and transformation. I know that I'm here to get certain like messages out there into the world. And I'm also here to work with people one on one and help them grow and help be a catalyst for people. How do I do that? While taking care of the earthy practical things, while putting a roof over my head, while eating, right? Whatever, I'll put it out there. Like, my financial thing, like, I bring in right now like $1,100 a month. And if it were not for my partner, I would not be able to have a house right now or have food. Like, she is supporting this venture, because I work with so many people on sliding scale. It's just not enough to sustain my needs, especially as a having student loans. But when I go to Bali, because that is a calling that I feel called to do, and it's all like all this stuff that I'm doing in my life, right? And all these things, they're in my chart, they're in my dreams, they're in everything. Like, I know these callings, right? Like, it's like, okay, I have to go and do these things. But I'm on my own financially in Bali, and $1,100 in Bali like would be enough if I didn't have like $400 worth of loan payments. That are not income dependent and just have to be paid. So I'm like trying to figure out that. So Virgo has to go through and be like, okay, where are we gathering resources, right? You have this calling, you know that you need to be able to put this stuff out there. You know that it takes time. You know, it takes a lot of your energy. It takes a lot of time to brew over these videos and to like be like, what is the message for this? It takes time to write them up. It takes time to record them. It takes a lot of work. Like, a session with a person might just be an hour, but you need to make sure, like, I need to make sure that I'm in the right mental space for it. I need to make sure that I've prepared for it, that I've prepared for what we're dealing with that day. Afterwards, I need to be able to release what isn't mine to have. I deal with a lot of people who have a lot of trauma, and that takes time to like let that stuff go, right? There's a ton of energy invested in these experiences, and in the work that I do. So Virgo has to go through and be like, how are we going to support you? How are we going to feed you? How are we going to house you? How are we going to get you in front of like the people that you need to be in front of to help them? Like, how are we going to figure out methods for you to meet these people and these people to meet you, the people who will be the most benefited by me as a catalyst in their transformation, right? How do we create these things? What do we do? And it can be a variety of things with Virgo, right? There are a whole bunch of different practical things to figure out. But I do encourage you, after coming through this Leo season, it's rough for a lot of people. Hopefully you got a feel for your calling. In Virgo, allow Virgo to help you support that calling and figure out how to make that into a reality. For me, probably going to hear me talk about like, hey, I got these guided meditations that you can you can do, and we can exchange some energy and resources. And I've got my astrology readings I do for people, my coaching that I do with people, to help heal and work with anxiety, stress, bipolar, finding their grounding after spiritual crises, or coming into new traditions, spiritual traditions, and figuring all that out. So yeah, so you'll probably see some of that from me as part of my Virgo work, and blessings on you and your Virgo work. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.